This year's Jets draft class may not have a day one starter. Now, you may think that's a sign of doom for the class of 2023. I don't think it's the end of the world, however, and I'll explain why on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, May 1st, we're in May, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show on YouTube for free or wherever you get your podcasts so that you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review, and if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Well, over the weekend, the NFL draft concluded. There are 7 new members of the New York Jets, but amazingly, there may not be anybody who starts for this team on week 1 from that class. You look, the first round, the Jets drafted Will McDonald out of Iowa State, a guy who projects to be a situational pass rusher this year. He's a defensive end. He'll play defensive end for the Jets. He'll line up at that wide 9 technique in Robert Saleh's defense, but he's probably got to put some bulk on if he's ever going to be a 3-down player, and I think the Jets are looking for that. He's got the frame to certainly add that bulk, and usually your first-round pick is a guy who steps right into the lineup. And then the second round, Joe Tippmann, probably the first offensive lineman off the bench. I think he's the number 6 offensive lineman. I think if there's an injury anywhere on the line, Tippmann goes in and they'll reshuffle the line. And then you have day 3 picks, and day 3 picks in a weak draft, there might be a guy or two who steps in and finds a role, but I'm not sure there are any starters on this draft class, or at least week 1 starters. There may be guys who fill in during the season, but I don't think the Jets have drafted anybody to step right into the starting lineup. And now you may say that's a sign of doom. I don't agree with you. And I'm going to explain why on today's episode. Now, I think we got to start with Will McDonald. Your first round pick, usually you look at that guy and you say he's a starter. I don't know that that's the case with Will McDonald. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not the case with Will McDonald because, again, he plays defensive end. Carl Lawson's going to start at one defensive end spot. It looks like the Jets are keeping Lawson. Early in the offseason, I would have told you Lawson would probably be a cap cut. I don't think it's going to happen anymore. Now, of course, because I said that, he'll be cut tomorrow. But John Franklin Myers is on the other defensive end. You also have Jermaine Johnson, last year's first-round pick, who could see a role. If in the event Lawson is cut, Jermaine Johnson would seem like the guy who would step into the lineup. So where's Will McDonald fit in? Well, you don't always draft a guy, even in the first round, to be an immediate day 1 starter. And it's true this year more than it's been in the past with the Jets. Last year the Jets drafted 2 guys, both of whom made immediate impacts, in Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson in the first round, and then also Breece Hall in the second round. In fact, the Jets had 2 rookies of the year last year. They had the offensive rookie of the year and the defensive rookie of the year. Well, last year the Jets were picking in the top 10 with both those early picks, with both those first-round picks. This year they were at 15, in part because the team was better, in part because of the Aaron Rodgers trade. Now, this year is also viewed as a weaker draft class, so you have to factor that in. Would Will McDonald be a middle first-round pick in most years? His game probably has a few too many flaws to it at this point in time. He could become a very good player, and I got to be honest with you, I've been watching some of the film on him, and I've been pretty impressed by what I've seen with his ability to get to the quarterback, but he's got to add some weight to the frame. He's got to bulk up a little bit, or else he won't be able to hold up against the run. So I think year 1, you'll see him in pass rushing roles. You'll see him on passing downs, long downs and distances, when the Jets are trying to hold a big lead and the other team's obviously going to throw the ball. I think that's when you'll see Will McDonald. I don't think he's going to be a full-time player for this team in year 1, however. Now, I think part of this is just a reflection of the Jets being a better team. In recent years, the Jets have been so bad, and you have to remember, this is a team that has not had a winning record since 2015. They have not been to the playoffs since 2010. And on some level, it's not the worst thing in the world that your first-round pick may not be an immediate starter because the team's better. That's one of the things that shows you. The Jets have had to put some guys who have been really raw right into the starting lineup over the last decade plus. I mean, you can even go back all the way to 2012 when they drafted Stephen Hill in the second round. This was a second-round pick. This was a wide receiver with pretty much no NFL caliber qualities outside of athletic testing. I mean, he was big and he was fast. in the testing drills, but this was a guy who pretty much had none of the tools you needed to succeed at the wide receiver position in the NFL, and the Jets were so thin at wide receiver that they had to throw him right into the lineup. And you can go through the years, you can find guys who just were not ready to play, who had to be thrown into the lineup. And I think there were years, a lot of recent Jets teams where Will McDonald would need to start because they had so little off the edge. This time they have quality players because they have the guys I mentioned. Lawson, who I think will still be here. Jets, please don't cut. If you're going to cut him, please don't cut him tomorrow and make me look ridiculous. You've done that so many times this offseason. So Jets, please hold on to Carl Lawson, at least for a little while. You have John Franklin Myers, really solid player. And I know there's a theory that he's going to move inside to defensive tackle. I don't know about that. I mean, it's possible, and there is a hole at defensive tackle at the moment. But I don't know why you'd move a guy who's been pretty effective as a defensive end if you can avoid it. And there are some quality defensive tackles who are still available, some guys they can sign late at this late stage of free agency and keep John Franklin Myers on the edge. You have Jermaine Johnson, last year's, he was the third first-round pick last year of the early picks from 2022. He was really the one that did not make a big impact. He flashed here or there. In fact, I felt like almost every game Jermaine Johnson played, there was one noticeable good play from him, but he did not make an impact on the level of a Sauce Gardner or a Garrett Wilson or even a Breece Hall. You also have Bryce Huff, excellent situational pass rusher. And when I think about passing downs this year, you can mix and match. You've got a lot of talent now. I love the idea of the Jets being able to rotate guys in and out. And if Carl Lawson needs a rest, or if John Franklin Myers needs a rest, or maybe on passing downs you could kick him inside. Off one edge you have Bryce Huff, a guy with incredible speed. Off the other edge, Will McDonald, another guy with great burst. I love that idea. So you've got pieces around this draft class. You have pieces around this first round pick, and this is what you should try and do as a team. You should try. I think in an ideal world, you don't want many of your draft picks playing as rookies unless they earn their way into the lineup. Now, if somebody goes out there and wows you and shows that he's the best choice and he beats out quality players, that's one thing. But you don't want to have to just put him out there because you don't have anybody else. That's happened way too frequently for the Jets through the years. You can just name the class. A couple of years ago, Denzel Mims, who had to be thrown in as a starting wide receiver. It's been happening with too much frequency with this team. You want rookies to not have any pressure on them. You just want them to be able to go out there and play. And the other thing about this, I always say this, I understand that we've all been, including me, we've all been labeling the Jets a win now team. I'm glad the Jets did not take that approach to the draft. I'm glad the Jets did not focus on short-term profit in the draft. The draft is always a long-term deal. And one other point I'm going to make about Will McDonald. He's a guy who, yes, he needs some development. He's got to add some bulk, or he's not going to hold up against the run. There are some things he's got to improve upon. The success for a pick like this is not what he does in year one, although I do think he can contribute in a situational role. He actually has a fairly refined set of pass rushing moves. He's got a couple counters. He's got a good rip. He's got a good swim move. He uses his hands well. The spin move's not that great, but I think that's something you can work on. You see the beginnings of what could be a good spin move, even though it's not a great spin move right now. So there are things to work with, and I think he can make an impact. Him saying he's not going to be a day one starter, right now that means he's not a 3-down player. He could make an impact this year, but you're really focused on the long-term impact. You want him to be a great player year 3 to year 5, because Carl Lawson's probably not going to be here in 3 years. John Franklin Myers may not be here in 3 years. You hope Jermaine Johnson and Bryce Huff are, but who knows how Huff's contract situation will go. You still don't know what you're getting in Jermaine Johnson, really. Is he a rotational player? Is he going to be a guy who can take on the starting role? So you want to keep adding, you want to focus on the long term. And if Will McDonald turns into a good long-term player for the Jets, that's really the focus. But that's not the only thing you should focus on. And as we continue on this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast, I'll give you a few more thoughts on why I'm not so focused on Will McDonald's rookie season and why the selection could say good things about the Jets' long-term team-building intentions. That's as we continue this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. The NFL draft is now over. We've got a long wait to the first games of the NFL season, so you might as well treat yourself to a snack. And let me suggest Built Bar. You've got to try these bars. They're delicious. They taste like candy bars. They're covered in 100% real chocolate. But even though they come in delicious flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and cookies and cream, they're actually protein bars. They don't taste like protein bars, though, because, again, these bars are covered in chocolate. They have these delicious flavors. And beyond that, these bars are actually healthy. There are only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and 17 grams of protein on most bars. And now you don't need to wait for a box. For years, you've been hearing me talk about ordering your Built bars at Built.com, but now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. Well, you can still get those specialty flavors at Built.com. So you can head to your nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built bars. Get a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. Or if you're close to Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box of hit flavors like brownie batter puff and churro puff. Or go to Built.com. You can still do that if you want to have your bars sent right to you. You can thank me later. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Today we are talking about the rookie class of 2023. The Jets drafted 7 players over the weekend in the NFL draft, and I'm not sure any of them are day one starters. And you may think that dooms this class. I don't think so. Now listen, you'd rather have rookies contribute than rookies not contribute. Last year, one of the biggest reasons the Jets improved was all of the production they got out of their rookie class. But getting a class like that with Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, that's just not something that happens. That's maybe a once a decade, maybe even a once every 2 decade type class for a franchise. That is not the norm. Now, in an ideal world, yeah, you'd get some rookie contribution. I do think there will be some contributors this year for the Jets from their rookie class, but you're not necessarily looking for rookie production. You're looking for longer-term production. And what the Jets did over the weekend, I think, does align with some of the better practices when we talk about building your team for the long run. I think one of the things you see good teams do all the time is they invest at certain positions even when it's not a dire need. And 2 spots that I think about are edge rusher and offensive line. And we know that the Jets, they've actually done pretty well adding edge rushers over the last 2 years. I mean, when you think about where the Jets were in 2020, how little they had in terms of pass rushing talent off the edge, it's night and day. Offensive line, we know they've invested a lot, and they have not done so well there. But you're always focused on adding the next player because you never want a position to get to a crisis point, especially spots as important as edge rusher and offensive line. For the Jets, edge rushers are defensive ends. In other teams, they're outside linebackers. But for the Jets, they are defensive ends. That's one of the things the great teams do is they draft guys before a big need arises at a certain spot. And it's true for the Jets in both spots. Both defensive end and offensive line. And one of the things that I think the Jets did that was smart before the draft was re-signing Connor McGovern. Because when they did that, they took the need out of drafting a center in the second round. Prior to that, it wasn't really clear where the Jets were going at the center position, and it felt like maybe they would just have to reach for a center because they were so desperate there. Once they re-signed Connor McGovern, and they got him on a cheap deal, under $2 million for 1 year, they were no longer desperate at center. But they knew that McGovern was probably not a long-term player for them. So what this allowed them to do was say, you know what, if we happen to be on the clock at 43 in the second round, and the center happens to be the best player, and we love what this guy brings to the table, we can still take him. But now we're not desperate. Now we don't need to do it. And I think the same is true at pass rusher. And one of the things that great franchises do, and the Jets are nowhere near a great franchise right now, but the Jets want to get there. The Jets want to be one of those teams that's constantly in the mix from year to year. One of the things they do is they draft players a year early, and they draft players not for what they'll do as rookies, but they spend the year developing them. And essentially what happens is, in the right situations, the veteran player who's the incumbent starter takes the youngster under his wings, and he trains his replacement. And that's one of the things you hope to see the Jets do this year. If Carl Lawson is indeed here or John Franklin Myers is around, they kind of show Will McDonald, this is how we do things. This is what you want Connor McGovern to do with Joe Tippmann. And yeah, sometimes an injury happens. I mean, if the Jets suffer a couple injuries at defensive end, Will McDonald will be thrown into the starting lineup. I think the Jets are one injury away from Tippmann playing. If it's an injury at center to McGovern, Tippmann steps right in. If it's an injury at guard, again, Tippmann steps right in. A lot of thought that he can play the guard spot, even though he did not have a lot of experience in college. If there's an injury at tackle, what probably happens is Tippmann goes to guard, Elijah Vera-Tucker goes to tackle. So Tippmann will have an opportunity to play if there's an injury on the offensive line, but essentially, for this year, I think he's a depth player. I think he's there to learn, and if he outplays Connor McGovern in training camp and preseason, if Tippmann shows that he's ready to go, he'll step right in. I don't think the Jets will hesitate to go to him if he shows that he's ready to go. But now the Jets have the luxury of bringing him along slowly because I think there are some technical things he needs to clean up before he's ready to play consistently well in the NFL. And the same thing goes for defensive end. I think one of the things you see the best defensive teams do is they just keep drafting pass rushers. With those teams, you never hear about how they drafted the defensive end. That's a bad pick because it wasn't the need. Those teams develop ferocious pass rushes because they keep on investing, because they keep bringing in players. And one other final point is just the overall quality of this class was not very good. And I understand there was some disappointment with McDonald, especially because there was the talk, would the Jets have drafted Broderick Jones if he fell, and the Steelers traded in front of them to get Broderick Jones, and the Jets swapped picks, so they fell from 13 to 15, and Broderick Jones goes at 14. But ultimately, Broderick Jones was a guy who had his own flaws, and I'm not sure he's necessarily going to be a great player. And so I think we need to slow down a little bit before we crown Broderick Jones the next great tackle in this league. And I think that was just true across the board. Even if the Jets had drafted Broderick Jones, there would be some question marks to him. There would be some things he'd need to clean up technically. There are some mechanical issues with him. And I think there are issues with pretty much anybody you draft this year. It's just not a deep class. This year, when we talk about the guys who went in the first round, a lot of them would be second-round picks in a normal year. I mean, I think Will McDonald in a normal year is a day 2 pick. This year, he deserved to go in the first round. This year, I think he clearly was one of the 32 most promising prospects. Now, will he pan out? We don't know, but anybody you drafted, there was no perfect prospect this year. There was no Sauce this year. There was no Garrett this year. There was no Brees this year. There was anybody you drafted, maybe Bijan Robinson, but he didn't fall to the Jets. But almost anybody you drafted had their own flaws, and it would have been difficult to find a surefire immediate starter the way you were able to a year ago. So it's just something to keep in mind. And when we talk about the day 3 picks, I mean, these are day 3 picks. Day 3 picks usually don't step right into the lineup. There might be a guy or two who can help on special teams. There might be a guy or two who can handle a more limited role. But there aren't going to be a lot of guys who are going to be plug and play types who are going to be able to step right in and play great. It's going to take some time. It's true with a lot of rookies, but I think it's especially true of this year's rookie class. Now, one area the Jets did not add anybody until day 3 was the tackle position. Yes, they did draft a tackle in the 4th round, but that's not somebody you can count on this year. And we know that the tackle position's a bit of a question mark with Dwayne Brown about to turn 38, with Mekhi Becton missing essentially 2 full seasons back-to-back in 2021 and 2022. Jets needed some insurance at the tackle position, and because they did not look to it in the draft, they looked to it in free agency on Monday. And as we continue this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about a player that they signed to help them out with their tackle depth. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Monday. The Jets made a signing on Monday. They try and improve their offensive line depth. They bring in veteran tackle Billy Turner. Now, I just spent an entire show telling you that there really were not many great plug-and-play options anywhere in the first round, especially at pick 15. But I think that had the Jets had drafted a tackle at 15, maybe they would not have looked to the remaining free agents, because they maybe would have at least felt like they had enough depth there. Once they were not able to add a tackle in the first round, I think they really had no choice but to bring in some sort of veteran, because Dwayne Brown's going to be 38. He was banged up for much of last season. Even though he did return to the lineup after missing the first couple of games, he was clearly playing hurt, and his play's in decline. This is not the Dwayne Brown who was the multi-time Pro Bowler through much of his career in Houston and Seattle. This is a guy who really is on his last legs. And then your other starting tackle is Mekhi Becton, who has barely played the last couple of years. So the Jets had to have some sort of insurance. So they go to Billy Turner. A guy who I thought they may turn to was George Fant, because there's familiarity with there, especially with the front office. And obviously Robert Saleh's been around him. The Jets did look for familiarity, but they did not turn to Fant. They turned to Billy Turner. Billy Turner's familiarity is not with the Jets. It's actually with Nathaniel Hackett, because he spent 2019 through 2021 in Green Bay, and then he moved to Denver in 2022. And through much of his tenure in Green Bay, he was a pretty solid starter. In fact, Aaron Rodgers had a lot of praise for him. He blocked for Aaron Rodgers for a few years. In 2021, there was a point where Aaron Rodgers was advocating for Billy Turner to go to the Pro Bowl. And I know you have all these metrics, you can throw out all these numbers, these grades about how good a tackle is. Well, I mean, I tend to trust his quarterback. When the guy's quarterback says this guy's good, and he says it in public, and he goes out of his way to praise his tackle in public, to me that carries a lot of weight, because the quarterback's the guy who's getting hit if the tackle's not doing his job. So if the quarterback thinks, you know what, this guy's doing a good job protecting me, I'm inclined to believe the quarterback. Offensive line's always tough to evaluate, because even though you have numbers, they don't always tell the whole story. The fact Aaron Rodgers likes Billy Turner, I mean, that speaks volumes to me, because Aaron Rodgers is the guy who's out there. It's one thing for me to say it. It's another thing for the guy who's got 300-pound linemen bearing down on him with Billy Turner if Billy Turner doesn't do his job well. Now, Turner had a bit of a rough 2022 season. In fact, if you speak with people in Denver, I mean, they'd probably tell you he was never really healthy. He was limited to about half the games, and even when he was playing, he was not fully healthy. So this is actually a classic May signing. When you look to May and June, there are always decent players who are available. There tend to not be many stars left, but there are guys who can help your team out there. And they're usually available for a reason. They may be old, and Turner is in his 30s. They may just be looking for that last 1-year contract where they can stay in the league, but they still have something to provide. Conversely, they also may just be coming off an injury. And one of the reasons they haven't signed yet is, first of all, they're trying to show teams that they're healthy. Second of all, they're coming off a disappointing season, and there may be some skepticism. Was it the injury? Was it that the guy's play is in decline? I think for number 3 tackle, this is not a terrible move. Listen, I'm not going to act like it changes everything. I'm not going to act like tackle is no longer a question mark for the Jets. I'm not going to act like we have no concerns about the tackle position going forward. But when it comes down to it, the Jets simply could not sit with what they had at tackle. Brown and Becton and no viable backup plan, it just didn't work. And at least with Billy Turner, you have a guy who conceivably could step in and play decent enough football. And I know they have Max Mitchell, but Max Mitchell was overwhelmed last year when he stepped into the lineup, and he could be good. Max Mitchell could develop, but I would never want to count solely on. I would never want to put all of my eggs in the basket of a 4th-round pick stepping into the lineup and developing in a big way over the course of one offseason. It can happen. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying we write off Max Mitchell, but that's very different from me saying, with Brown and Becton, knowing that you need depth, I'm good with Max Mitchell and no other option. So I think Billy Turner, it's a signing that makes sense for the Jets. I don't know how much of an impact it's going to have, but I do think that the depth is a bit better today than it was yesterday. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.